You can kind of walk us through that as well then?
We're going to talk a little about all of those things. As far as changes to the budget process, the underlying process has been the same in the entire 10 years that I've been here. It's dictated by law. Offices and departments submit their budget needs to the Board of County Commissioners, actually the auditor's office. Budget staff package that, if you will, and deliver a budget to the Board of County Commissioners, who then consider everything that has been requested, and then you set a budget as you see fit, given the resources available. Now, there can be, and there have been, every year, direction given about how to approach that process. About 5 years ago, for example, we went from a line item where the Board of County Commissioners looked at every single item that was submitted independently, and commissioners decided to take a different approach. And I and budget staff worked with every office and department and presented some options on how to approach it, and the consensus was priority-based. So we formed priority teams who gave recommendations. We'd set priorities in our budgets. Those teams gave recommendations to the board on what the most important things in their area was to fund. Some offices and departments liked it, some did not. But
Can I stop you there?
yeah, sure.
When you say when the board gave priorities, can you give an example of a priority so I have a sense of the scope of that?
So we formed
Right.
teams, priority teams. So like the law and justice sector was a team. The courts formed a team. The general government was a team. And each of those teams set their own priorities because they're the experts in their fields. And they came to the board. What the board did was said, you have this much money to work with. Tell us how you would recommend the board spread that scarce resource. And the teams would come and say, we think that these things should be funded to the point where they'd run out of money. Some teams declined to give recommendations to the board, let's say.
Can I give a little perspective again on that? As I
Sure.
recall, my first year, it was, many of them liked the idea, the teams liked the idea because they know, we don't know, we're not the experts, like Robin said, in their field. Let us prioritize. So they liked it. Others did not like it because what I've heard from them was it caused a lot of internal wrestling and wrangling and hurt feelings. Well, I need more this is more important than your office, and this is more important than my department. And some were directors and some were electeds, and there was that power imbalance. And so they didn't like it for that reason.
Right, but at the end of the day, all it was advice to the board. The Board of County Commissioners has the final say in how a budget is appropriated.
Let me just interrupt and add to one more thing that you said, and some of them did not participate in it, and that caused some aggravation. I think this all happened around 15 or 16.
Yeah, about
16.
4 years ago,
That
4
was
or
one
5
of the
years.
first things the new board in 2017 had to deal with, because there was particularly law and justice, didn't provide those recommendations to the board. So the allocation was moved into 2019, and at that point, the commissioners decided how the allocation should be. And I think going back, I think it was a little bit of a different perspective as to what the intent of the teams were. Some of the feedback that we received, how come somebody from outside of my office can tell me how the operation should be run? And never was the intent to have a conversation as to how the individual mandates should be established. It was the additional funding the commissioners allocated to each of those teams to perhaps, as opposed to have individual requests from the individual's office, the intent is that additional funding can be addressed as a system level, as a system-wide. And that's what I believe at that point, the law and justice was allocated significant $1.2 million. Is it from the law and justice point of view, from the overall system, what the purpose they see where we can put this finite resources?
Right.
And
And again, it was to provide an expert recommendation to the board with the offices and departments being the experts in their fields. So that was one approach we took. There was a year where we did a budget freeze. No policy level items were funded. There was a year when there were budget cuts. So the fundamental process is the same, but there is a direction given, and that is the same as any jurisdiction. A budget has to respond to the economic conditions and the amount of revenue that you have to spend. So there are going to be different approaches every year. Best practices in budgeting are updated every year, and that's some of what we're going to talk about today, because the direction you give on building the 21-22 biennium budget will be different than it would have been in January, given the crisis that we're in. So that's the rather long answer to what should have been an easy question. So, what are we doing to respond to this crisis? I'm on page 4. The page number is pretty small. Next time I'll make them bigger. But here's a quick bullet list of all of the things that financial staff across the county are doing. The very first thing we did is set up codes so we can track expenditures. We're tracking every penny spent in the hope that we'll be able to claim it from somewhere. Which in part addresses are we asking any office or department to absorb? We're not asking any office or department to spend money that is outside their current budget. We're getting regular reports from the 2 departments that are spending the most at the moment, emergency management and public health, so we can keep track of how much is being spent. The treasurer, as you know, has delayed property tax payments for 1 month. For individuals, we spent time looking at the cash flow in the general fund. Denise had already been tracking that. I took a quick look at the road fund. We determined that those 2 funds could absorb a delay of revenue for 1 month with no threat to cash position. The assessor is considering setting property tax values at January 1st, 2019 levels. Now, I don't have time to explain all of that, but if I understand Stephen, and he can explain much better than me, part of what that is doing is valuations were completed just before the crisis hit. And if we go into an economic downturn, any values that we send out based on 2020 assessments would be inflated, and we would get a ton of appeals. So to give us time to adequately address the economic downturn, Stephen is considering setting the levels from a year ago, just freezing that, if you will. And I'm sure he'll let you know that I'm not explaining it very well.
Plus new construction.
Yes, we will add new construction. So the impact on the property tax levy is none from Stephen taking this action, but the impact for property owners and the workload on our assessor and BOE staff could be significant. One of the things we're doing is watching for every grant available. When we catch wind of anything, we ask our grant manager to look into it and find out how to apply for money and what we can use the money for. As you know, we've received the Commerce Grant, and the emergency management is working very closely with the Washington Military Department. You may ask why the military department. It's because That's where the Washington State Emergency Management is housed. And so we're working closely with them to ensure we'll be able to maximize any FEMA grants. We are checking with all of our current grantors. We had grant managers send out letters saying, will we be able to charge administrative leave to your grant? And so far the answer has consistently been no. No, you cannot. So we're looking to see if there's any other way to cover that paid leave rather than out of the general fund. We're asking what other jurisdictions are doing. Romero and I spend time on a conference call every week with other county leadership. We spend time on a call with both the cities and the counties. I connect with what finance officers around the nation are doing through GFOA. We're trying to find out what are people doing and what are the estimates. So we're spending time doing that. And as I said earlier, we are watching many, many webinars to try to get our heads around how to assess the impacts of this crisis.
Since you're on that topic, may I pop in real quick? What are you finding, not nationally, but within this state, with other counties? Are they doing the same thing we are with giving employees 14 days or 2 weeks of admin leave, or they?
It is all over the place.
Okay.
Everybody's different. There's some using similar models as we have, some using totally different. But we'll give you additional details on the commission's check-in where we have a specific item to.
Oh, good, thank you.
Yeah, we'll talk a lot about that later. So on page 5, here are the costs to date. Public health so far, including salaries, the main cost there has been personnel costs, has spent about $116,000. This is out of public health funds. And it should be reimbursable from the Department of Public Health. The emergency services is mainly out of, I believe, Medic $1. We're checking to make sure that that fund is healthy enough to bear this cost. We should be able to recover all of these costs from FEMA. Right now, it stands at about $156,000. Emergency management is general fund, yes?
And related to the FEMA reimbursement, if we qualify for FEMA reimbursement, it's not gonna happen most likely this year.
I'll get there.
So,
Yep, I'm totally gonna say that. Emergency management is general fund, it stands at about $90,000. Total cost so far, $363,495. That is as of March 31st.
January to current.
Yeah, but the bulk of the costs are in May.
Okay.
You know, really,
In May
this
or
is
in
as
March?
of the point we stood up the ECC.
In March.
Yep, March, thank you. May hasn't even hit us yet.
Okay.
What's the 54,000, or I mean the 50,400? What is that, professional services?
You know, I'll look that up and get back to you. It's probably a few different things, but I don't have that at my fingertips. I can tell you some of the things that we're considering coming up, that when the numbers of patients hits a surge, we're going to need to provide transport. We're talking about temporary county employees to provide transportation services. We're talking about renting an entire hotel to provide for isolation and quarantine. That'll be about $100,000 a month, roughly. And then there's going to be a continued need for supplies and personnel to, and we don't know how long this is gonna last. So this is just the opening number. Again, we're tracking dollars. Some of the things not included here that they are being tracked and they will be added to future numbers, is the miscellaneous expenses like the plexiglass, that we're purchasing and installing. We haven't bought it yet, that's why it's not here. And the paid administrative leave for staff who've been unable to work, we'll have that information starting next week. So there are more costs than this. We're still trying to get our heads around just how much it all is. Moving on to some of the economic predictions. I'm going to start with a slide, this is slide 7, on flattening the curve. We've all been talking about this, and this is a graph from the CDC. I'm sure that people have seen this. It is exactly what we need to do. It's why we have stay-at-home orders and social distancing and have been shutting down our businesses. We need to get that peak of the health crisis down so that our healthcare providers can manage the surge of cases. What this does, and it reduces the number of cases and should reduce death in our community, right? So less cases and a lower peak. But what you see here is that flattening the curve extends the time. And what they talked about in the webinar is that, again, flattening the curve is exactly what we need to do for society, but it prolongs the economic distress. So all the things that we do, stay at home, close the businesses, that will happen for a longer period of time so that we can flatten the curve. And that was something that I hadn't thought about before. And it's important to understand.
For recovery.
Exactly. And the quote that you see on this page that I took away from that webinar is that we're gonna be in this space for more time than we would like.
We've already hit that.
I've certainly hit that
Yeah.
point long ago, but we're gonna be here for a while. If you turn to page 8, Denise sat in on a webinar from Moody's, one of our financial companies. They do bond ratings, and they were talking about the global recession. And I would say that right now economists aren't saying if and when, they are saying now and how long and how deep. Those are now the questions, that we are absolutely going into a recession. They say it's going to be an economic tsunami with 3 major waves. We're experiencing the first one now, that's massive layoffs. That will cause a decrease in household wealth. And with people not having as much money to spend, businesses will be tightening their belts. There will be bankruptcies and failures, and the cycle will continue. That's what causes a downward economic cycle or spiral. And Moody's is predicting that the economy is going to be many months, if not a year more, to recover. And then I list some of their major assumptions. We should see the peak in April. We are on an exponential curve. We haven't even seen the numbers start to grow yet. The Federal Reserve is working to keep financial and credit systems functioning, and they are telling us, and we've already seen it, Congress and the White House are going to be passing waves of bills that are intended to help. So hopefully it won't be as deep or as long as the Great Recession, but I've heard numbers that unemployment could reach 32%. And that's the highest number I will ever have seen. Even in the depth of the recession, it was under 20%. So the numbers they're talking about are
The Great
scary.
Depression was in the 50s percentile, I think.
Yeah, it
I heard
was
the comparison with the last recession and then the Great Depression. So we're not anywhere near the Great Depression, but we're exceeding the other with the recession?
the recession,
Yeah.
in unemployment
Like
numbers.
6.6 million filing for unemployment or something like that?
Right, just unbelievable numbers.
Yeah.
On page 9, and I am moving through these fairly quickly, we start to look at what our funds are gonna be impacted.
The Great Depression had a 24.9% unemployment.
29.4, I heard it was a
That was
little lower.
24.9.
Yeah, so it was a lot higher.
That's a 1933 number.
Wow.
This could be bad.
And where are we right now?
I can find that number and give out to you.
He's on it.
Oh,
the
good, yeah,
projection
he's
is
looking
30.
it up. Yeah, that's
numbers are like a week and a half delayed though, too.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true. And Denise had looked to see if the unemployment claims numbers had been posted yet for this week, and they're behind because they have been inundated with claims. So while Romero looks for that, on page 9, we start to look at the revenues in our general fund. And Olivia and Denise, I can't tell you how much I appreciate all the work that they've been doing. They've started to put together graphs, as GFOA had recommended we do, to start to look at the past, because we don't have better information than that right now as we start to project the future. So here are some of the funds that are going to be impacted. There are 3 major types of.
The current unemployment is not ready yet, because past week, we, as you know, we received a 6.65 million unemployment
Filings.
filings.
That's what I was looking up when you saw me on the phone. I was looking that information up. Couldn't find the current rate.
No,
Is that validated?
they haven't equated that.
Yeah.
But that's nationally.
That's not.
Nationally, right.
Yeah.
And Florida's helping that curve too.
Gonna go up. So are land use and permit funds going to be impacted if we see a decline in the construction industry? And there will be at least some decline this month as businesses are on hold. Our road fund is going to be impacted because people aren't driving around a lot right now, so less gas tax collected. We'll see the impact of that probably, I'm not sure what the delay is on receipt of the gas tax.
We'll see that on the third quarter.
Yeah, third quarter, that sounds about right. General fund, of course, property tax. We will probably see some inability to pay property taxes, so our revenue there will go down. And sales tax is the most volatile, I'm making up words now. It's the most volatile or sensitive to a recession type of revenue that we receive. So we're gonna talk more about sales tax in the general fund in a moment. But sales tax doesn't only come into the general fund. We also need to look, and here's a list of the other funds that we need to start taking a look at. We're only on the very beginning of doing this analysis. We need to look at public health. That's where we should see a lot of money coming in, but that money is going to be restricted to specific uses. And what is gonna happen with our other public health programs? That's part of what we need to look at. We need to watch the housing fund. It's partly funded with revenue from recording fees. We're gonna see that go down. REIT, if the real estate transactions start to drop off, the amount of money available to you for projects in REIT will decrease, and I'll be particularly looking at our capacity for our own buildings in REIT 1. Medic 1 and Conservation Futures are funded by property taxes. We're gonna have to watch the impact on those 2 funds. And treatment and detention sales tax funds, obviously sales tax. So whatever that downward trend is in the general fund, we'll see a similar trend in those 2 funds. So those are just a few of the things that we're gonna be watching for that will be impacted in this economic crisis.
On public health, what are the main sources there?
Major source in public health is grants. And the concern is that the federal and the state government are going to have to shift funding from the grants that we usually receive to addressing this crisis. So it's the other programs we're gonna have to watch in health.
Are the courts going through something similar so they understand that if the TST money is severely impacted, I mean, it'll be impacted, but severely, that their therapeutic courts are funded with TST money? Are they looking at this as well to come up with some type of a plan B, then what they will do if that money is severely cut?
So we are just on the beginning of this. We'll be working with the courts, but it's up to us to start to assess what the impact is and then work with them on what the response to that is.
So they haven't had this yet?
You're seeing cutting edge information.
Okay.
I just had a conversation with Judge Price, my regular, and I did start laying out some of the potential impacts. It's not just the treatment sales tax and perhaps some specific programs will be affected. It's impacts to the general fund. And the general fund, as you know, funds all the law and justice. So it is more than just those specific programs that's funded by the treatment sales tax. It's the overall impact on the lack or the reduction of sales tax coming to the general fund.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
I'm typing a note for me when I meet with Judge Price again.
Do we have that meeting this
You
afternoon?
have an update with Judge Price this afternoon.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's spend a few minutes talking about sales tax. That's the next page in your slide, and you've got two graphs here. I have at my fingertips and was able to quickly put into this presentation information going back to 2006 on actual money coming in. And what you see is collections have been on a upward trend for quite a while now. This is in nominal dollars, it's not adjusted for inflation, but inflation has been low and we've been collecting more and more every year. It's been pretty amazing. But if you look at the year-over-year trends, and this goes back to 1992, what you see is a normal economic cycle, and that's the bottom graph on page 10. So in the 90s, you see a dip, and I've been trying to remember, was that an oil crisis in the 90s, the early 90s? You see the dot-com bust in the early 2000s when and this is a growth, sales tax growth went down, it goes down in a recession, it rises in a recovery period. You see the Great Recession from kind of starts in 2007, where you see a sharp decline in the growth and then negative growth. And then it bottomed out there for quite a few years. We started to hit recovery. In recent years, we've been doing 10% year-over-year growth. That's amazing. But it started to soften. And in 2019, the growth wasn't as sharp as in prior years. And if you turn back to page 9, one of the things I would ask you to notice is that the revenues has started going down across the board in 2019. Property tax growth was flat, sales tax growth came down, the growth in the road fund came down pretty significantly. That could be because we increased diversion. I haven't looked into why that is yet. And the nominal revenue in our permit center went down even in an extremely robust construction year. So things were starting to soften, and this crisis just has pushed us over the edge.
Could you explain a little more on 2019? I thought that 2019 was going up on sales tax. What is your analysis of that?
Collected, the amount of money we collected was a sharp increase,
Yes.
just in dollars.
Okay.
But the growth has been coming down. So what that does is, it still grew, but not as much as it might have done.
I know, but it still shows a reduction in income there, and I thought we had.
No, it's reduction in growth.
It's a reduction in growth.
So
Lower
if-
percentage of
yeah,
growth.
So for
Right.
instance, if you, let's assume you have $1,000 that came as a property tax. In 2020, in 2018, you had a 10% growth, right? So you had $1,100 coming in. So that is the new baseline.
Right.
But in 2018, the growth was only 8%. So
Well, I
Right.
think, I don't know, that, to me, that's misleading, but
Cool,
we'll leave
it's
it at that.
percentage of growth, it's not,
Okay.
not the dollar amount.
right.
We are live streaming now. They got it fixed.
Thank you for letting us know.
Yes.
So the big question is, the big red question mark is, what's gonna happen next? And we're not gonna know for a few months, because sales tax comes in on a 2-month lag. The amount of money that the county received from the Department of Revenue on March 30th was what people had spent in January, before the recession. We can't learn anything from that. In fact, the last forecast
Left the conference.
update from the Washington State Economic and Revenue Forecast Council said COVID-19 is going to have an impact. And then went on to talk about how robust the economy was in February. And it really was. But we can't learn anything yet because we don't know where it's gonna go. And we won't know, so spending and tax collections in March, we're not going to receive those until the end of May. And for April, we won't have that until the end of June. So we're flying blind here. And what GFOA said is that we're in a time of uncertainty and that we need to be able to accept that we're living in a time of uncertainty and that we're going to be here for a while. In the same way we're in economic distress, we're in that boat in a time of uncertainty, and it's almost impossible to predict what's gonna happen. They say, here is they called it the AAA rule for dealing with uncertainty. First, accept that uncertainty is inevitable. We're not going to be able to give you all the facts, we don't have them. Second, they say assess the uncertainty and use what they call analog references. And what that means is find something similar that you can start with as a starting point to assess where we're going. And the third A is to augment your expectation for uncertainty. And what they said that means is once you find your point of reference, expand on it because it's probably not big enough. So what you see here is a range of the potential for revenue shortfall from sales tax receipts. We know it's gonna go down, but we don't know how much. So using a reference point of the Great Recession, in 2009, we had a negative growth of 9.3%. So I used that as the starting point. If we were to lose 9.3% negative growth, that would mean that our original budget estimate for sales tax of $19.4 million would be overstated, or we wouldn't collect $2.3 million. That would be the size of the problem that we have. So when you talk about offices and departments aren't being asked to absorb anything, my answer to that is not yet. Because if we're going to experience this kind of a revenue shortfall, then our appropriation levels are too high. And that's what we need to start to be able to address. Now, I don't know if that's the right number, nobody knows. and we're not going to know for a while. So what I've provided you with is a range. If the best possible thing happened and everything just stayed flat, and we collected exactly what we did in 2019 for sales tax, we're still short by $632,000 because we anticipated growth. If it's 3%, then we're short 1.1 million. If things get really, really bad and we're short by 18%, we could lose $4 million. Now, is this the right range? I don't know. But it gives us something to work with as we start to think about how are we going to address a revenue shortfall of this magnitude. That's the challenge before us.
Are you ready for a donut?
Yeah,
No,
something
right,
nice,
Bloody
'cause
Mary.
this is not easy stuff.
My goodness.
I also need to mention to you the status of the fund balance. I'm sure that you heard the amazing news while I was off on a cruise that was fortunately completely free of coronavirus, for 2 whole weeks.
That was the discussion.
That was, the name of the ship was the Miracle. It was truly a miracle, everyone on board was healthy. So, during my trip, Darren Bennett said, here's your ending fund balance for 2019, it's your beginning fund balance for 2020, $20.5 million. It was amazingly high. I asked him how much that was accruals, because you remember we started doing an accrual for our sales tax. It's an accounting entry. The sales tax accruals are $4.7 million. That's not real money. That's a paper transaction, if you will.
I don't understand that.
And does that mean you take that away from the 20.5?
Yeah, because the ending fund balance, we add that accrual, it's money we already earned and haven't collected yet. And under generally accepted accounting practices, we have to add that in to our revenue. But it comes right back out when you start the next year. So
Yeah,
I know,
that, basically
that-
that money is not available to you to spend. And I'll
A little more,
talk
give me a
about,
little
in the
more
interest of
clarification.
time, we can't spend a lot of time on it right
We
now.
went through this in early 2019, that's when
We had to
the
start doing
state auditor require us for us to do this accounting entry.
So previous to that, we weren't even counting this money.
That's
No,
right.
Because then even in 2018, remember, it was a bump, but $3 million?
Yeah,
Okay, I remember that.
So that, and it really was not real money, it's the same. It's
not real money.
Coming here.
Okay. You got it, Gary?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
We also accrue grants that we have earned but have not received. Grant money is restricted, it can only be spent on certain things, and to accrue it, you have to have already spent it. So it is also not available to you to spend to the tune of $1.2 million. That brings us down to about $15 million. That's really what's available for you to work with. Part of that has to cover cash flow. I think that we're very fortunate that we were in the position where we were talking about $1 million windfall from the legislature in 2019, and you were about to establish an emergency reserve. That $1 million is there for you to use. But as we look again at the magnitude.
Those were fun days.
Yeah, exactly. Between the amount of money that we're spending on this crisis and
Denise, do you want to chime in?
I'm sorry, you cut out there for a second right before your question.
Did you have anything to add?
The beginning fund balance?
Yeah.
No, I agree with what Robin said. It makes sense that we're looking at the 14.6 million.
right.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Okay, so I think the phone was doing something
Real
weird.
estate manager, Public Works.
Is now joining the conference.
Okay, so basically, when you look at the potential magnitude of the problem, that $1 million is not gonna get us through this crisis. And that was one of the things that we had to figure out. We need to get comfortable with uncertainty. When will we have data available? We're gonna start getting payroll data on who's on paid administrative leave next week. So we'll be able to start to figure out the cost of that. As I said, sales tax revenue, we're not gonna know until May and June, and those will only be the first 2 months. We're gonna be looking at every single month trying to figure out the shape of this curve. Property tax revenue, Jeff extended the first half for 1 month, but we're gonna start to see what the real distress is when it's due at the end of October. I think that's when we're gonna start to be able to figure out how many people just are not gonna be able to pay this year. And the updated forecast estimates from the state, we are hoping they would normally do an update in April. WASAC has asked for them to come out with something sooner to help us all try to figure this out.
We're waiting for that ghost wave to come in.
Yeah. Yeah, we want the good stuff. So the last slide
Has left the conference.
is on budget containment options. And before we start looking at the items on this handout, I just want to say, it's just a list of ways to reduce spending or increase revenue. It's nothing new. Anyone who's been working in finance for a long time is going to recognize these things. We brainstormed a list, again, Denise and Olivia have been doing an amazing job. We are not making recommendations today. We are absolutely not. You need to start to think about what's available to you though. And we do strongly recommend a discussion with other elected officials and department directors about what might work. Now, they're all gonna tell you they can't afford to take a cut, but you may be in a hard position to have to make one and they need to be able to tell you how they're able to manage. Every item has a downside. None of this stuff is easy. The easy stuff went away 10 years ago. So every one of these things is hard. It's gonna have a consequence. I'm not able today to tell you what those consequences are. We need time to do analysis, but we need to start getting our heads around these things. So moving on to the list, you see a comprehensive list. I'm sorry we run out of time. But as I said, none of them are good. So in staff related, it's things like, and by the way, before I start saying what some of these things are, other jurisdictions have already started these things in anticipation of managing the downturn. So it's not like no one's doing this stuff. There are jurisdictions, all of the jurisdictions are talking about it with their leadership, the same as I'm talking to you, and many of them have already begun. You heard Romero talk about a hiring freeze. Some jurisdictions have already put those in place. You heard my opinion of hiring freezes. But doing a soft freeze on a requirement to hold a position for, say, 3 to 5 months, that does save money. So things on this list around personnel are not granting COLAs, temporary salary reductions, voluntary furloughs, hiring freeze, layoffs. These are the not good things that we haven't had to do yet. And again, our budget has appropriation to pay for everyone, but our revenue might not support that. Eliminating overtime to the extent possible.
Can I ask you, I suggested something like that and you said that was, you never heard of that ever happening?
Eliminating overtime.
Yeah,
In state agencies, I've seen agencies that were able to manage overtime, but we'll never be able to completely eliminate overtime in 24/7 operations. You'll always have some. And it's managing it is the real question here. What I think I said I'd never seen any savings from was a hiring freeze. Hiring freezes, in my opinion, have never saved anything. Other types of expenses, we can ask offices and departments to set aside a percentage of their appropriation. We could reduce expenses on a last in, first out, which means we'd look at your most recent items that you authorized and take those away first. Now, does that make sense? No. No, it does not. And neither does an across-the-board cut, because you are not protecting the highest priorities of the county. So one of the items on this list is take a priority-based approach. What are the most important things that need to be protected? We can maximize the use of home monitoring to minimize jail costs. I think we've seen that the jail is already doing that and the sheriff has implemented that. We can require every office to do a deep review of every expense and tell us what they can save. We can eliminate travel, sort of. We can cut back on training. We can delay equipment purchase. We can delay our capital projects. On the revenue side, we can raise fees and eliminate general fund support to any activity that can be supported with fees. That is an option that they attempted to implement in 2010 and that over time got kind of stepped away from. We can look again at interest sweeps. I think that there are only a handful of funds out there where we're not taking all the interest we can, but we can take a look and see what else might be out there. Although in an economic recession, the amount of interest you collect is not very much. We can take, right now, our offices and departments earn rebates on the spending on credit cards. We could take all the rebates and put them in the general fund and not give the ability to spend those rebates to offices and departments. That's walking back something that we had an agreement on. It reduces an incentive, but it's something you can do if you're in a position where every penny counts. Some other things you might look at, again, reducing or eliminating general fund support for non-general fund departments, continuing or increasing the road tax shift or diversion, sorry, Jennifer.
You're killing me.
I know, it's killing me too. I don't know how long we can afford that. We'd have to do some analysis on the impact to road services. Build reserves. This is a funny thing to be on a reduction list, but what we're hearing in the national presentations is reserves are intended to cover you for 2 years. Don't spend them all now. So we would look if there's a way to build any reserves. We'd also be looking for any windfalls. And then last on this list, have offices and departments develop robust performance measures and use those to determine funding. Again, none of these are easy. They're all bad choices, with very few exceptions. And we need to do more analysis, but you need the information about what's possible. We're gonna keep adding to this list, and we'll bring it back for another discussion in the very near term. Now, I am encouraging you to meet with your fellow electeds and your department directors, but I'm suggesting to you that that needs to happen soon. You can't wait for the May meeting we need to get our heads around, because the longer we wait to address a shortfall, the less time you have to implement savings.
You wanna get that sorted out so we can meet with them all?
Yeah, we can probably have a Zoom meeting. Obviously, we cannot bring all of them in this room.
Okay. Gary, do you have any questions?
I do have a follow-up to that.
Go ahead, then.
And this is getting to what I believe is some of the options you may consider at this point. And I strongly gonna be suggesting the board, the 5% hazard pay that you approved for the sheriff's office sunsets on Monday, April 6th. That was the direction of the board. I strongly encourage you for you to sunset that. You continue to have additional requests from other offices. And that 5% expenditure, we're gonna have to pay that at the end of this year. And based on the numbers, we don't have a crystal ball as to how that will be, because it will be already an expenditure occurred that we need to compensate at the end of the year. So I strongly encourage the board to sunset that decision of the 5% hazard pay to the sheriff's office, corrections, and the coroner's office.
Will we have a good amount of time to discuss that then?
No, this is my suggestion to you.
I understand.
And you have enough time to do however you like to.
Because the sunset's Monday, you said, or two Mondays, so
Monday.
when we discuss that in depth, so we can make, is that coming up in commissioners check-in in the next 2 hours?
Whenever you're ready.
Okay, so regarding the budget piece that Robin just presented, question, Gary?
I just, as you make that recommendation, before I need to consider that, I need to know how much does that cost us per week, for an example?
We'll get to that discussion. I'm not, I have,
But I need that before I make the decision.
you bet, yeah. But any questions on the budget piece that Robin just presented? Any questions, Gary? On the budget presentation?
Well, I just think that what we need to do right now is pick certain issues that are scheduled to be done and put a hold on them. I don't think we ought to build a jail annex, for an example. I don't think we ought to pave roads for a while. Maybe culverts, maybe the sand shed. I know it's not a lot of money, but why do it now? It's been all these years. Let's hold back where we can and then make those decisions farther down the road.
Okay, any questions, Robin?
I don't have any questions of Robin. I mean, I guess my response to that or question is, the identified examples that Commissioner Edwards just gave, those monies are restricted to certain purposes, and then we wouldn't be able to use that. I'm asking, I don't know.
Yes.
We wouldn't necessarily be able to use them to meet these other needs, and there's an economic impact to stopping those activities, just like you really wanted to keep residential construction going, you really wanted to keep projects. If we have these monies and they're limited for those purposes, it seems like there's some advantage to keeping those economic activities going for the broader economy of the
That
county.
is a correct statement.
I do want to follow up on that though. And yes, I realize a lot of those are earmarked, but for an example, paving or the sand shed or whatever, we may be able to do a diversion on some of those. The jail, it's kind of solving itself. Why move ahead with that when that money in the past has been utilized to pay corrections officers' salary and overtime? I'm not saying it's right to do that, but any of the issues where we've been restricted on what we can or can't do, I think we need to rethink that. I would much rather go to a jury at some future date and explain why I deviated from this policy or that procedure laid out by the auditor, for an example, or state law for that matter. I think we're in uncharted waters here. We need to think about moving forward the best way we can serve the citizens with the resources we have. And if we have to make a decision at this board level that we are not going to follow exact guidelines of the past, because we're no longer in the past. We're stepping into the unknown future. And I believe we need to think ahead in that regard. And so be it if we need to do things that aren't quite exactly laid out by the bureaucratic laws of the past, so.
So if I may,
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry to jump in, but just a clarification, the money being used for the jail is not from the detention sales tax fund,
REIT one.
which we can use for staffing. It's coming out of REIT one, which cannot be used for operation costs.
Well, that's what you're saying, it cannot be used. I'm saying we need to relook at what can and cannot be used. Those rules were laid out by bureaucrats that wanted control over how money was spent before this communist virus ever came up.
So-
Now we're in a new arena.
We are in a new arena.
The state might relax rules on how money's spent for.
Very possibly, and
We would
why
have
move
to-
ahead with
We would
something?
have to evaluate.
Are we gonna have sufficient
We've already
time,
been told
Robin,
that the federal government and
Are we gonna have
the
sufficient
state are
time
not relaxing.
to talk about each of these issues?
So we will find more time on your calendar to talk about this more. This is just initial.
So we'll go project
Yeah.
by project and say yes or no, where the funds going, can we divert it or not? We'll have
Right.
sufficient time for
We're
that.
gonna find a time.
So getting back to your presentation, my question is, how many, not which ones, but how many represented employee contracts are we negotiating currently?
8 or
There's
currently
only two left.
2.
They're-
Two?
Juvenile detention is still open. We've got a 1-year agreement with the sheriff admin. And.
Well, and here's my reason, Maria and Robin, is I've settled, negotiated several contracts over the years, employee contract negotiations, labor unions. And it would seem to me that I would look at it and say, wow, this isn't a good time to try to negotiate something. I would want to put it off. And I don't know if that's an option or not, but that's the cost that's a great unknown as well, if that makes sense.
And so we do have a 1-year agreement because of the circumstances with the sheriff deputy administrative support staff.
So we're gonna
And
keep everything in place and extend it?
we'll extend the contract and they'll get the 2.4% COLA that everybody else has already received. And we're trying to get a similar agreement with OPEIU, who are juvenile detention officers.
Okay.
And so that's in the works right now.
So at least we have two that are extended.
And the rest are,
The rest
you
are
know,
settled.
the ASME is all settled.
Okay.
Sheriff deputies, corrections deputies, those are all settled.
All right, thank you. Are we done with the budget piece? Okay, now we go into
Commissioners check-in.
Commissioner's check-in.
Can you have a 5-minute break?
Anybody need a break?
5 minute
Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. 5-minute break. Be back in 10:20, 10:20.